Did you know there were James Bond games made before GoldenEye? I know, crazy right? There were a lot actually. Before Rare and Nintendo cemented the style that would forever be associated with the franchise in video game form, for better or worse, the Bond IP was thrown from developer to developer, who would release games in almost every existing genre to any console that would house them, to, let's generously say, varying degrees of success. But those were not the only ones left to drown in the sands of time, not by a long shot. Even during its peak video game popularity, the franchise saw its fair share of overlooked releases, and I'm not just talking about the surprisingly large amount of Java games for cell phones, though we'll definitely take a look at those in the channel sometime in the future. I'm talking about games released by the likes of EA and Activision, some of which are direct movie adaptations. Those are the ones I want to focus on this video, the black sheep, the outliers, the ones that maybe only the most hardcore fans might have known about, but that most people have certainly never played. I'm Manuving, and let's talk about the weird and forgotten Bond games, shall we? This is the very straightforwardly titled James Bond 007. At face value, the name and the fact that it was released on one of the first home consoles, the Atari 2600, implies a fairly simple game.
Survive, and you become the master spy, 007.
But hey, the last time I played a game with that title on an underpowered console, I was pleasantly surprised, so I was eager to give this a shot. Okay, just a heads up. I'm going to be playing a few games from the early years of computer gaming, and I'm woefully unqualified for the task. Back then, I suffered from a mild case of not being alive, and despite my best efforts over the years, I've struggled to find any real appreciation for the pre-NES era of gaming. Don't get me wrong, I understand the historical value these carry in the evolution of the art form, but actually playing them, not that fun, as it turns out. James Bond 007 is developed by Parker Brothers, the toy company behind the likes of Monopoly, Clue, and Risk, before they became a part of Hasbro. How they got the James Bond license is unclear, as in my research I didn't find any other type of product released for the franchise from them during this time period, just this one game. And look, I know I'm stalling, but that's because there's really not much to say about this game. It is in essence a vehicle action game, not the last we'll see by the way, where the goal is to use your car slash ship slash plane to avoid enemy attacks, while at the same time trying to destroy them to get more points, and eventually make it to the top of the leaderboard. Like most Atari games that try to show a little more ambition than your Pac-Mans and asteroids, James Bond 007 is a big old clutter of pixels, where you have to use your imagination to decipher what's what. Luckily, the manual serves to contextualize each level and understand the overall concept. According to it, MI6 has provided the player, taking the role of Bond, with a multi-purpose vehicle that has the properties of a car, a plane, and a submarine, to take on 3 missions based on previous films: Diamonds Are Forever, The Spy Who Loved Me, and Moonraker. While all the levels play the same, the objectives to complete them vary. In Diamonds, you have to land on the villain's oil rig that for some reason is invisible and only appears briefly when shooting a giant flying diamond that flashes near it. Side note, I think it's a really cool attention to detail that this oil rig belongs to Serafino Spanks, the villain from the Diamonds Are Forever novel, instead of Blofeld as it does in the movie. This was likely due to rights issue with the character at the time, since it couldn't be used by the movies or any other media related to them, which is how we ended up with him appearing in the unofficial movie Never Say Never Again. Meanwhile, the Moonraker level requires you to destroy a set number of satellites, and The Spy Who Loved Me ends by destroying Stromberg's underground base. This all sounds simple enough, except this is an old game, so while it is pretty short and simple in theory, actually playing it is another thing altogether. You are attacked from every direction possible, while moving rather slowly and floaty, so things get very frustrating very fast. I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out the shooting patterns of the enemies, so trial and error became the name of the game. This is doubled or tripled by the last level, at which point things move at too frenetic a pace. I could not consistently pull off the things I needed to progress, and there were so many unavoidable attacks killing me off that I was infuriated. This 10-minute game became a 2-hour slog, and when I finally was done with it, I was more relieved than excited. This also comes with the territory, but the constant flashing lights and digitized sound effects gave me a headache within 5 minutes. This definitely made the whole experience more sour. It also features the first of many digitized bad quality versions of the Bond theme I had to listen to for this video. And I think I hate this song now? I jest. But really, it becomes grating how developers focus exclusively on that track, as if there weren't any more iconic Bond songs. It's hard for me to rate this game. I feel very negatively about it, but whether that's my own derision for these kinds of games or legitimately the game's fault, it's hard to tell. Though, ultimately I think this is genuinely terrible. If you're familiar with this one, let me know in the comments below if I'm talking crazy. The Atari 2600 was just one of the platforms where this was released. Among other home computers, it was also released on the 2600's successor, the 5200. It is essentially the same game, except a little better looking, and it adds one final mission based on You Only Live Twice, but there's not enough money in the world to make me go back to replay this. After the release of James Bond 007, there were a few text-based adventures released on the Commodore 64 and other platforms, so I wasn't able to do a deep dive on them. I'll leave links to playthroughs of all of these in the description below. I mostly wanted to bring them up because two of them, A View to a Kill and Goldfinger, were written by Raymond Benson, who would go on to write the official Bond novels in the 90s and early 2000s. My adventures in old-ass Bond games continued with The Living Daylights, the first in a series of games developed by Domark, a British developer and publisher who would later become Eidos, publisher of classic franchises like Tomb Raider, and most relevant for us, Hitman, by developer IO Interactive, who at the time of this video coming out, are still in development of the first James Bond game since 2012. Like its Atari predecessor, this was released on a bunch of computer consoles, some of which I hadn't even heard about before. The BBC Micro? Really? But the one we're taking a look at here is the most easily emulated one, the Commodore 64 release. Things take a turn for the better here. Not only is this more recognizably Bond, but most surprising of all, recognizably The Living Daylights. The best way to describe it is a light gun shooter played with just a keyboard, not even a mouse. Bond moves on the foreground, while trying to aim the reticle to eliminate enemies hiding in the background. Very simple stuff, yet surprisingly playable. Still, the thing that stands out the most is how faithful it remains to the movie. Each level is based on one of the scenes from the movie, starting with the training mission in Gibraltar, the assault on MI6 headquarters, and the final battle in Afghanistan. The attention to detail is felt all throughout the game. The menu screen between missions is an accurate recreation of Q's lab from the film, down to the Aston Martin Vantage and all the different gadgets Q shows Timothy Dalton. In Prague, you can see Georgi Koskov closely follow behind as you escape, and there's even a level where you have to shoot the infamous balloons used by Necros. It doesn't pay much attention to the plot, and there's no way for someone who hasn't seen the movie to take this as anything other than a random collection of levels. But considering how convoluted the plot of the film gets, that might be for the better. It's just cool that it's represented so well, and you can at least see the effort put in the adaptation. Sadly, that's as much as I can give it in terms of positive notes. While the core gameplay is decent, there's not much depth to it. Basically, if you play the first level, you pretty much experience everything this game has to offer gameplay wise. There's a little bit of strategy involved in selecting the correct side weapons from the options you get between missions, as it could definitely make your life easier in a level. But that's as complicated as it gets. This repetitiveness means that by the time the difficulty picks up, and boy does it ever pick up, there's more frustration than fun. A common thread it shares with the previous game. At some point you're just absolutely bombarded with attacks from the foreground and the background, coming at you in all directions, and that really drains the enjoyment out of a game that is not exactly overflowing with it. For a big fan of the movie like myself, it's a treat to see so many familiar beats accurately represented in low-res pixel graphics. It's a drag though that I had to experience all the tedium to get to that. In 1988, the franchise was in the middle of its 2-year release cycle. So instead of waiting for Timothy Dalton's second output, Domark decided to pull from the catalog for the next game, and the movie they chose was the previous Bond's first film, Live and Let Die. Why go so far back for the concept of the next game? Why, capitalism of course. See, this wasn't supposed to be a Bond game. It was originally developed as a powerboat action racing game called Aquablast, before someone at Domark saw it and went like, hey, if you kind of squint, that looks like the boat chase from Live and Let Die. We've got the license, let's put the Bond name on it and make us some money. Or at least I assume that's how it went, because what we're left with is a game that is to Live and Let Die what 007 Racing is to racing, which is to say, not much at all. This is a pseudo 3D racing game played from the third person perspective, where the objective is to avoid obstacles and shoot enemies and targets. There's some strategy involved in trying to pick up the old tanks spread throughout the course, so as to avoid running out of it. But with only 4 levels and not much to do except trying to beat your high scores, there's really nothing of note to this one. The reality of these types of old racing games for me is that the perspective messes me up big time. I find it difficult to perceive depth and understand distances, so inevitably I end up crashing over and over, which culminates in yet another case of frustratingly hard game that I could not get any fun out of. There's not even anything particularly Bondian that I could grasp here. Only one of the 4 levels is actually based on Live and Let Die. Maybe if you're generous you could say that the desert and Arctic levels are based on The Spy Who Loved Me and A View to a Kill, but that's stretching it. The truth is that for an arcade game like this, each person is going to make different things out of it. Perhaps someone will enjoy coming back to perfect each run in a quest to get a higher score. For me, the 20 minutes or so it takes to go through all 4 levels is as much as I'll ever care about this one. Luckily for Domark, 1989 saw the release of Timothy Dalton's second and last Bond movie, License to Kill. Once again, they had a movie out of which to base the game on, and right off the bat, this fares a lot better than their previous attempt. Like The Living Daylights, the License to Kill video game faithfully follows the film's plot by focusing on turning its main action sequences into a series of shooting galleries. This time played from an overhead perspective. The variety comes in the approach to gameplay for each individual level. Although a shoot 'em up in principle, each level borrows from a different popular game from the era for its main conceit. The pre-credits helicopter sequence is turned into a Tiger Heli clone, where you have to take control of the aforementioned helicopter to chase Sanchez, the villain of the movie and the game, while destroying enemies and avoiding their projectiles. The second level borrows from the original Metal Gear and similar isometric 8-bit action games, though it lacks much depth. This one is a shooting set piece that is particularly awkward to control, as Bond needs to stop to shoot and you need to be very specifically positioned to be able to aim correctly. Later on you'll be jet skiing from the back of a plane, avoiding sea mines and other obstacles as you make your way to the cockpit, and the game finalizes on a truck chase that mimics the climax of the movie to a T. All of this is pleasantly familiar to people who have seen, and if you are like me, loved, the film, and it all plays well enough to provide an entertaining time. It's certainly the best of the Domark games, and the best one I played up to this point. The problem once again arises in its punishing difficulty. This is yet another case of a game that is less than 20 minutes long, taking over 2 hours of trial and error. This happens enough for me to admit that I'm just terrible at these games, but it does rob much of the fun of what otherwise is an enjoyable time. I know I've complained about every game using the Bond theme non-stop, so it was a nice surprise that this one doesn't. But then it was baffling to realize it uses the theme from You Only Live Twice, a film and song that by the time this game released was over 20 years old. It's particularly crazy if you consider that even if the License to Kill song wasn't a banger, they had 2 of the biggest movie songs from the 80s to choose from, with A View to a Kill and The Living Daylights. Hell, even the more boring but Oscar nominated For Your Eyes Only would have been a more senseful inclusion. After the release of License to Kill, Domark will go back to the film catalog for the next game adaptation, The Spy Who Loved Me, based on what people who don't appreciate the genius of Octopussy consider the best Roger Moore Bond film. It's a vehicular action game that takes the iconic Lotus sequence from the film and extends it into a full game. Played from a top-down perspective, this one shares more than a passing similarity to the Spy Hunter franchise. I would say it's a straight-up rip-off. which is a full circle moment for both franchises, considering the original Spy Hunter on arcade was pitched as a James Bond game. What sets this game apart is the Lotus. Once the upgrade is purchased, you gain the ability to take it underwater, at which point the game becomes something more similar to something like Galaga, or literally any other space shooter. Despite the mechanic being a nice throwback to the movie, in practice being in a pitch black background means you might as well be in space and playing a Moonraker game. I know by this point I probably sound like a broken record, but my god, this game is difficult. With unavoidable bullets coming out of everywhere, it is near impossible not to take damage. Then there's the lack of fluidity to the controls, meaning that getting a handle on the car was a challenge unto itself. This all meant that I played atrociously, just a giant dookie of a playthrough, like a caveman who had just been unfrozen and had never held a controller in their hand. I crashed, exploded, skidded, and hit every pedestrian, swimmer, and innocent bystander in sight. My Bond in this game was the most incompetent interpretation of the character since the 1960s Casino Royale. And while all of this makes for deliciously stupid footage, playing it is not actually much fun at all. This is the one game that beat me. I didn't see it through the end, despite, again, it being very short at its core. I couldn't find any evidence pointing to this, but I'm pretty sure this was another case of a different game being in development and Domark slapping the Bond name on it last second. The early 90s were a weird time for Bond. There was a terrible sounding planned third outing for Timothy Dalton, complete with robot villains and a computer virus that would destroy the world. It never materialized due to multiple legal battles related to the ownership of some of the stories, which resulted in the movie series stuck in limbo for half a decade. But still, the franchise strung along, with multiple novels, a cringy but generally enjoyable Saturday morning cartoon spin-off, James Bond Jr., and of course, video games. There was the action platformer based on James Bond Jr., which we'll talk about some other time, and the Sega exclusive James Bond 007, The Duel. Released in 1993 for the Genesis, The Duel is a side-scrolling 2D shooter with platformer elements that feels nothing, and I mean nothing, like a James Bond game. And while Bond games come in different shapes and genres, the particular aesthetic decisions here are what always made me feel like I was never really playing a Bond game. For starters, the color palette is atrocious. Not that every game in the series should be drab, grey and hyper-serious, but there's an over-the-top cartooniness that doesn't jive at all. The locations for each level also feel out of place, though at face value they might seem familiar. A warship, a jungle, a secret volcano lair. Their visual design is a bit too eccentric. Think Metal Slug being played in Sonic the Hedgehog levels. In all, there's a feel of total randomness, and a lack of awareness of what makes the franchise's aesthetics great. Then there's the frustrating parts. The level design can be confusing, with too many areas being similar to previous ones, and vertical movement being hit and miss, making finding the women to rescue annoying. Platforms move slowly, like really slowly. It feels like forever waiting for them to appear to proceed where you need to go, and enemy weapon drops explode after a bit, which is such a bad design decision that it feels like the developers are trolling you whenever you go out of your way to grab one just to have it explode in your face. Things don't get much better in the gameplay department, though this is a lot more competent than some of its predecessors. The shooting is too simplistic to be fun. The movements, especially when landing from a jump, is slippery and it's hard to tell what you can actually jump on, making the platforming quite poor indeed. And the gameplay loop that consists of navigating levels to rescue a set number of Bond girls before setting up a bomb and leaving before the timer runs out is very repetitive. To end, I'll just say that having fall damage in a game with platforming of this level of quality should be criminal, but it is not wholly unplayable. Once you understand the timing and the nature of the bad platforming, it's not hard to pull off. It never gets overtly confusing or hard, and there are a few nice cameos from characters like Jaws and Mayday, though they are far too easy to make a lasting impact, same as the final boss. What we're left with is a mediocre game that doesn't stand out in any way. Not fun enough to play through, not enough of a curiosity to go out of your way to see. It's just there. The Duel was also released on the 8-bit Sega Master System in a simplified version that removes most of the mission objectives and features completely different layouts despite the levels being somewhat similar. It, of course, looks a lot worse graphically, and the movement is a lot slower. Jumping also changes dramatically, as it almost feels like Bond is floating from place to place. There's no music in gameplay, and honestly it's just a mess. If the Genesis version is just mediocre, this is absolutely awful. The sheer audacity of releasing a game of this quality is almost admirable, and then to release it twice, oh boy. Yes, the 8-bit version was also released on the Game Gear, which is the same as the Master System version, but uglier. The Duel, in all its different versions, will be Domark's last go at the Bond series, and it would turn out to be a fitting closure to their uneven reign on the franchise. Let's jump a few years to the early 2000s. Only 4 years after GoldenEye had changed the landscape of console first-person shooters. We were in the middle of EA's reign on the franchise, and besides an outstanding N64 outing for The World Is Not Enough, things weren't looking so good. In 2001, we had yet to reach the heights of Nightfire and Everything or Nothing, and we were just coming out of the atrocious 007 Racing. A few months before EA's first attempt to correct ship with Agent Under Fire, they unceremoniously threw out the Game Boy Color version of The World Is Not Enough, 2 years after the movie and 1 year after its console counterparts. To say this version of the game is late to the party is an understatement, and if you think that extra development period might have resulted in a stronger game, you're about to be as disappointed as I was. Developed by 2M Productions, a studio credited with only 2 other Game Boy Color games released shortly before this one, before going on to develop phone apps until they were presumably closed sometime in 2009, The World Is Not Enough for the Game Boy Color does away with the first-person perspective of its console siblings and instead adapts to the handheld by being a top-down adventure game similar to the Nintendo-published James Bond 007 for the original Game Boy. But where that game shines with charm, polished gameplay, and interesting semi-RPG ideas, this is an unpolished, clumsy, repetitive, and straightforward affair that throws you into the action with nary an indication of how to play and what to do. It follows roughly the same levels as the N64 version, but with completely different layouts and objectives adapted to the new gameplay style. But it does so with no creativity. Each level consists of a series of snaky hallways that need to be explored to find items, and press buttons and levers that allow access to new parts as you progress. That they are big, empty, and boring to navigate is the least of its problems. The layout in every single one is nothing short of atrocious, and they usually require you to consistently backtrack in an effort to pad the length of the game. If you don't know what to do, and trust me, this game will not make it easy for you to do so, running in circles becomes par for the course. The lack of checkpoints also means you have to do it an obscene amount of times. This is perhaps the game's biggest problem, but it's far from the only one. The gameplay itself is clunky. Movement is slow and most actions take forever. One example is holding down the B button to shoot. It's not intuitive, you have to do it for each shot and it takes a couple of seconds each time. Enemies will get a couple of shots on you by the time you take your first, not to mention that you have to be perfectly aligned first. That's if the enemies take action though. Sometimes they'll just stand there as you shoot, which is admittedly hilarious the first few times, but gets quite boring after a while. You can sidestep this by ignoring weapons altogether and focusing exclusively on melee attacks, which is what I ended up doing. But that's not much fun either, as both yours and the enemy's hitboxes are incredibly inconsistent, and attacks simply don't connect easily. Every time I thought I had figured out the exact position to make them connect, they just didn't. Things only grow more frustrating as the game starts to focus more on stealth, and that stealth should be in giant quotations, because there are no extra mechanics introduced. Everything is played exactly the same, but there's no way to know if you are in an enemy's visual range. It doesn't help that, like everything else, their AI is inconsistent. They can go from being completely blind to relentless from one screen to the next. In some parts I could walk right beside them and not be noticed, while in others, they wouldn't even be on screen and I would be detected. This all culminates in the worst gameplay element the game has to offer, the side-scrolling levels. Mercifully, they only show up twice, but they are by far the worst segments in the game. The jumping is even floatier and slower than the 8-bit versions of the Duel, and sometimes it requires you to jump between platforms while avoiding enemy attacks from the top and obstacles from the bottom, which is impossible to do without taking damage. Then there's the single pixel platforms that you are required to land on. The level of precision required with these controls can't be called anything but unfair. It's just a remarkable level of trolling from the developers. Then there's the rest. Ugly visuals, flat looking characters, confusing objectives, and little things like having a picture of Carter in a cutscene where Robinson is doing the talking. Which sounds nitpicky, but shows a lack of attention to detail that carries throughout the entire game. Thinking about all the great handheld games that were out by this point, hell, thinking about how good of a use of the license James Bond 007 was on the original Game Boy, that going back to this just feels subpar. It is easily the worst game on this video, and that is saying a lot considering the quality of some of the previous ones. But if I'm being honest, in the end the thing that made me the most angry is that I had to pull a fucking guide to beat a fucking James Bond game on the fucking Game Boy Color like it was fucking Metroid. Come the fuck on, EA. Originally, The World Is Not Enough was supposed to be the last game I tackle on this video, but I don't want to end on a downer. So let's wash the bad taste in our mouths by jumping even more gears. Now far away from the grasp of EA's greedy hands, to jump into the embrace of the not at all greedy Activision. I feel like every version of Quantum of Solace, the first in the franchise from Activision, and the first one starring Daniel Craig, is more or less forgotten. The HD versions are unfavorably looked at, perhaps justifiably, as boring Call of Duty clones. Nobody's talking about the DS version, and the Wii one can probably fit into the shovelware port category. Then there's the PS2 version. This one was developed by Bond Game Hall of Famers Eurocom, which right there makes me excited to play it. While the other versions went for the Call of Duty route, this one went for my preferred style of Bond game, a third-person shooter. Except this was in the middle of the Gears of War and Uncharted era, so that means we get a cover shooter. That's not a bad thing in and of itself, and it's eventually fun to play. It just takes a while to get a handle on it, and it's never not awkward. And that's all down to the controls and timing. To take cover, you have to hold one of the shoulder buttons, and you move the left stick on either direction to shoot. This is pretty basic, but the timing is what generally threw me off. It always takes a couple of seconds more than it should, and it's never very fluid or intuitive. Ultimately, it feels very flimsy, and can result in chaotic moments mid-action. This translates to the animations. While the game perfectly captures Daniel Craig's physicality, in particular his silly run, there's always an ever so slight delay in the movement that makes it feel sluggish. In action, this means that the simplistic melee combat feels random, and it's hard to tell when the bullets are impacting the enemies, though this is also partially the fault of the extreme recoil that every weapon seems to have. This is all such an in-the-moment feel that it is actually hard to explain, though luckily it's never game-breaking. Like I said, I was never able to get 100% used to the timing, but eventually I could adapt to each situation and make it work, which is good. Because following the split stories of Quantum of Solace and Casino Royale through a series of shooting galleries in third person can be quite fun. Clearing a room of enemies in between jumping from cover to cover has a somewhat addictive arcadey feel that keeps you going without getting bored, even with the general unpolished nature the game carries. The stealth works fine enough, and it's not always required to progress through a level, and even when it is, it's unobtrusive and fits the particular scene that the level is based on. There's a heavy focus on environmental interactions that are fun to pull off, even if the game makes them ridiculously obvious, and the enemy placement is too convenient to the point where it robs a little sense of discovery and satisfaction every time they are used. Even the mandatory for their time quick-time events don't drag and are used sparingly, so they don't ever break the pace as it so often happens in these kinds of games. And the hacking minigame gets a pass because even if it doesn't add anything to the immersion, they're so easy and they're done so fast that you don't even get enough time to be annoyed by them. The production value is another positive. Characters are outstandingly modeled, and animations are top-notch. The gun sound effects are weirdly satisfying.
Hold this location!
And the soundtrack is excellent throughout, with the highlight being the title track, an original song based off of the classic Bond themes made specifically for this game. the entire main cast of both movies is back too. Though it's clear that for all of them this was nothing but a paycheck. They're never Pierce Brosnan in Everything or Nothing level bad.
I'll use that last explosive here.
But with the exception of Judi Dench, who is always excellent in this, they all sound bored as hell.
Seems we're both using green to get to somebody.
Then you lost somebody too.
Yes, I did.
Despite the high production values, there are a few indications that this game was rushed as hell. Mini-Me has a great video, which I'll link in the description below, where he goes more in depth about the myriad reasons why development was such a mess, but this accounts for the gameplay flaws we talked about previously. And then there are the plenty of bugs, glitches, lack of variety in enemy models, and creative decisions that make it obvious. One being how every major plot point is condensed into these boring motion graphic briefings that go on forever and serve as info dumps that are not only not visually interesting, but don't do a good job at connecting the different levels. Eventually I just decided to skip them, as they add nothing of value to the experience. Rush development also accounts for the simplicity of the entire package. It's all over in about 4 hours. There's no multiplayer, and despite my description of it as arcadey fun, there are no high scores, spawn moments, or final ratings to aim towards, which is something that made EA's later games so replayable. And when you take into account how ambitious From Russia with Love, the last game on 6th-gen consoles before this one, is, what with its jetpacks, 1960s settings, and bringing back Sean Connery,
The name is Bond. James Bond.
this can't help but feel a little bare bones. It ultimately sits awkwardly between generations, not being modern enough to feel fluid, but lacking the charm of the more archaic 5th and 6th gen shooters, but it's still a worthy ride. It is easily the best and most recommendable game from this video, and it does a much better job at scratching that Bond itch for fans. That might be biased towards more modern games, but it's genuinely a decent time. Though those with more patience can find something to love in the License to Kill game, this is the one that I'd say deserves to be brought back in some fashion. So, what did I learn from playing all these old-ass games? Well, I always kind of knew that the franchise had more bad games than good ones, but this whole experience made me realize just how wide the gap in quality is. But it's still quite interesting to see the progress of game development through the POV of this particular franchise. Should this game stay forgotten? Maybe, maybe not. I'll leave that up to you to decide in the comments below.